Hey, did you go?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's 9 o'clock and time to convene the January 24th, 2020 Mobile Source Board meeting, committee meeting. Like to call item 1, which is a follow-up on the MOU for commercial airports.
Good morning, Dr. Berg. I will provide a brief follow-up report on the implementation of the MOUs with the commercial airports. As a way of background, last month the board approved the facility-based mobile source measures for the commercial airports that included the MOUs with the 5 commercial airports, as well as Southwest AQMD's enforceable commitments to achieve the emission reductions that were associated with the implementation of those measures in the MOUs. The board also directs staff to work with the airports on providing more frequent semi-annual reporting on implementation of the MOUs, and also discuss consideration of a potential rulemaking in the event that the MOUs were not successful. Just a quick summary of the measures that are included in the MOUs. There are 5 measures for ground support equipment, 1 for each commercial airport. These measures establish performance targets in 2023 and 2031 for reducing emissions from ground support equipment. 3 airports also have measures for shuttle bus electrification. There are also additional measures for incentive programs for LAX, and also a jet fuel pipeline measure from John Wayne Airport to eliminate fuel delivery trucks. We estimate that we would achieve about half a ton a day of NOx reductions in 2023 and about 0.4 tons a day in 2031 if these measures are fully implemented. As we indicated before, majority of the reductions that we anticipate from these measures come from ground support equipment, as you can see from the chart on the right. Even though the reductions may seem modest, but again, they are significant from that source category. Also want to mention that these ground support equipment are already subject to CARB's existing diesel and large spark ignited regulations. So there's already existing regulations that regulate them. And CARB is also considering developing a zero emission regulations for this category. So these MOUs would provide some interim near-term reductions surplus to the existing regulations. Of course, there's additional reductions from shuttle bus and heavy-duty vehicles that I mentioned. Aircrafts are not covered in the MOU since they're under the federal jurisdiction, and the heavy-duty cargo trucks will be addressed under the proposed ISR for warehouse. So in terms of how we are going to track the implementation of the MOUs, this is all in the MOUs already and as part of our enforceable commitment. So annually, the airports are required to report to us, provide detailed vehicle and equipment data beginning in 2021, and that would include specific detailed equipment data and emission calculations to see how much they're progressing toward the emission reduction goals that we've established for these measures. And that will go from 2021 to 2032. Under our enforceable commitment to EPA, we've also committed to provide progress reports to EPA every year starting in 2021. So by November 1st of 2021, as soon as we get our 2021 reports from the airports, we would have to submit to EPA progress reports in terms of the actual emission reductions that are being achieved, the actions that the airports are taking, and how much progress we're making towards those targets. And if EPA determines that we are not making enough progress by February of 2022, we would be required to develop substitute measures and submit them by November of that year. And this will happen through a public process, and the reductions will come from the airports. So based on the comments that the board made at the hearing last month, the airports now have agreed to provide semi-annual reports in this year, particularly in June and December of this year. They would be reporting to the Mobile Source Committee on the actions that they've taken so far and the next steps that are taking to achieve those targets. And also the annual reports will continue from 2021 to 2032. We're also recommending to come back to the Mobile Source Committee every year to give progress reports on how they're doing. And if sufficient progress isn't demonstrated based on their first annual reports that come in 2021, we will recommend by September 2021, which again next year, possible regulatory approach that would be developed by summer of the following year. So that's Dr. Berg concludes my presentation. Be happy to answer any questions you have.
Can we go back to the last paragraph of the last slide?
Yes, sir.
The last sentence says, by September of 2021, possible regulatory approach to be developed by the summer of 2022. What are the other possibilities?
It would really.
I think the other possibility is that everything goes according to plan and we're getting the emission reductions. And no action's necessary.
Can you take the slide down? That's not my question. My question is, if you don't achieve your goals and you're only possibly going to regulation, what's your other possibility?
So Dr. Burke, this is Philip Fine. I think the reason we put possible on that slide was because we would come back to the committee and the board to confirm that's the direction they wanted to take. So staff didn't want to presume to automatically move in that direction. If it was not, and if it was not a regulatory approach, it could be, reopening the MOUs or tweaks to the MOUs. There's other, CARB will have maybe some rules on the books by then. There's different possibilities that could affect the way we would move forward. So it would be a report back to the board that we did not necessarily meet what we thought we would, and provide options to the board, but one of those options would be that regulatory approach.
Okay. You can understand my dilemma.
Yeah.
Any questions on this presentation? If not, thank you very much for your presentation. Item number 2.
We have a public
Update.
comment.
Dr.
Sorry.
Burke, we have public comment on
Yes.
that.
We have public comment there? Okay.
Yeah.
Judy, would you handle the public comment?
I will. I can't quite read this name. I think it's Yassi
Yes,
Kabazadi. Tell me how I should say that.
that was perfect, actually. You actually
Okay.
got it right.
Good morning.
Okay. Good morning, board members and everyone in the room. My name is Yassi. I'm a community organizer with the Sierra Club. I also live and work in the Inland Valley. And the airport's issue is an important one for our air quality in the Inland Valley because we're facing expansion in air cargo in several facilities. And this year, we understand that it's under a MOU process, and I'm just here to comment that we hope to see staff looking at this as a long-term regulatory practice and future planning. Right now, we're facing a huge battle with the San Bernardino Airport's San Bernardino International Airport expansion, which is formerly known as the Norton Air Force Base, and the Air District has made comments to seek more accountability with how the 500 truck trips and the 27 flights per day near 12 schools and hundreds of residents will be, I guess, affected. So I'm just here today to say that airport pollution is a big deal, and we want to see more stringent, I guess, and accountability in that process for folks that live near and breathe that air. Children develop, you'll have colleagues of mine that are going to be speaking today regarding the warehouse issue too, so I don't want to speak for that on behalf of them. But I'm just here representing the Inland Valley today and hope to see future changes in the airports. Thank you.
Does staff have any comment for her?
Dr. Berg, we're well familiar with Yassi. Hi, Yassi. And as she mentioned, we did submit a letter regarding Eastgate to the FAA. That project, unfortunately, or let me restate that, that project was recently approved by FAA and is moving forward. We're engaged on the process and continue to work with Sierra Club and the local community on the issue.
Thank you very much. Any further public comment on this, on item 1?
Mr. Chair, could I ask a question about the San Bernardino Airport expansion? Is that going to be primarily a freight airport, or is it going to be passengers as well? I don't know much about that expansion.
I think our understanding thus far is that it's primarily freight.
Primarily freight, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. There's another comment from Harvey Eder on this item.
Okay. Mr. Eder?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, would we inquire whether Mr. Eder plans to speak on the other item as well? Because we normally have 3 minutes total for the comments.
So he has listed on this card items 1 and 2,
Okay,
and he's also asked to speak on public comment. That's
So-
a separate card.
that's a separate, the public comment is a separate 3 minutes, but normally the agenda item is 3 minutes total.
So he's speaking on items 1
and two.
and 2, all right.
Speaking under protest, disagree with that, don't think it's legal under the Brown Act and other rights. Good morning, my name's Harvey Eder. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition, etc. This all has to be taken in context of the Solar New Deal in the 16 plan, which has been purged by the district CARB and federal EPA, and we're fighting now for our right to present this in court, where we were run out of the call of authority and threatened imprisonment by federal marshals and the FBI last month in San Francisco. This is outrageous. Not to get your day in court, not to be able to file papers. Other people are outraged. I don't understand this. Okay? You're supposed to, there was a stay of proceedings and a writ of mandate to evaluate this and do what you're supposed to do under the law, as well as a stipulation. We've been communicating with ACLU. This has to be part of the immediate total solar conversion plan, which we first brought in the 1991 plan, which is, as it has been put in the 89 plan, that was a federal plan forced on you because you didn't meet the standards. Another federal plan seems in the offing and loss of federal money for not meeting, you're not going to meet them with natural gas. Solar, we've been negotiating for over 3 years to produce at least 5 Class 8 solar trucks, 1,000 Class 8 trucks a year. We've been produced 50 by 23 or 25. These have to be done through co-ops in the inland industry. In other words, the equity, 70% in the last 30, 40 years of the population had no increase in lowering the real income inequity. This cannot stand with the democracy. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We have $25 trillion in debt. We don't know what's going to happen. Social Security is on its way out. We've got to, right here, provide for ourselves and have equity for low and middle income in different types of ownership models and with help from the state. And we've been negotiating this and trying to get manufacturers to do this. It's time for a change. There is $7 trillion in an article by Samuelson in the last week or two of BlackRock and what they're going to do for the solar transition, the equitable, just solar transition. This stuff's in play right now. It all has to be stopped. We need legislation to stop. And they've got 35% low-income earmark that has to be brought up. It has to be done. Anything that's done, any contract that's signed on energy, solar, renewables, and everything, and the transition has to have this in it. It has to have the plan. We need to study this and do it now. Thank you.
Okay, those are the only cards I have for public comment on this item, on these items.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Mitchell. Then we will move on to item number 2.
Morning. My name is Ian McMillan. I'm a Planning and Rules Manager here at South Coast AQMD. I'd like to talk today a little bit about our warehouse indirect source rule and give a little update on where we are currently. There's a lot of material in here. I'll try to be brief. So the need for this warehouse ISR was laid out in the air quality management plan. We have a significant challenge to meet the ozone standards. We need to reduce our NOx emissions quite substantially in the near term and in the medium term. Indirect source authority is one of our few opportunities and our few areas where we have an opportunity to require reductions of mobile sources. And we know that mobile sources are really where most of the NOx emissions are coming from, in particular for goods movement. We recently submitted a contingency measures that included more than 80 tons per day of NOx reductions through federal measures and new incentive programs. Indirect source rules were not included as part of that, but at this point, really everything is on the table to try to get these emission reductions. In May of 2018, the board directed us to develop an indirect source rule, really focusing on regional ozone levels. A lot has happened since then. That was almost 2 years ago. We've been doing a lot of work since that time. I'll be walking through some of that history in this presentation. One of the key things that's happened subsequently is AB 617, and there's been a very significant comments from community to make sure to look at the local impacts and make sure to look at those community impacts in any indirect source rule.
Are we still on the agenda? Are we on the agenda?
Next slide, there's a lot of detailed graphs on here. I'll try to walk through those to make it a little understandable. So on this top left graph, you see two crossing lines. The blue line that's going up are lease rates. And what we see is that in the post-recession period, lease rates for warehouses have doubled, or even a little bit more than that. Whereas the vacancy rate has plummeted. It's now less than 5%. The graph below that shows substantial growth in the warehouse industry, certainly in my lifetime, and we've seen that we're well aware of the recent growth, but it actually continues back through time. What's different, say, since about 2005 is almost all of that growth has been in the Inland Empire. So we know this is a robust industry. That's not really a surprise to anybody. For the pie charts on the right, we've just broken down a little bit of kind of trying to classify these warehouses by size. And so that top pie chart shows that a little bit more than half of all of the building area for industrial buildings is in the largest buildings, greater than 100,000 square feet. Meanwhile, even though that's about half the building area or a little bit more, that really is only about 5 to 10% of all of the buildings. So it's a very small number of buildings relative to the total inventory makes up most of the area. So that's about 3,300 facilities. There's various estimates about how many of these are owner-occupied, but we think it's a smaller fraction. Only about 20% are owner-occupied. The rest are leases. For that last pie chart, kind of in the middle, where there's of those 3,300 facilities that are the largest, about half of those, 50%, are in Los Angeles County. But what we see is that there's, comparing that to the bar chart just to its left, that you get smaller buildings with more of them in LA County, whereas the Inland Empire has fewer buildings, but they're larger. And again, this is, the data backs up to what the general knowledge is. Looking at this from an emissions perspective, we're still working on trying to make sure we have a well-refined estimate here, but an earlier number that we presented to the board was about 37 tons per day associated with all warehouses in our jurisdiction by 2023. That's after the truck and bus rule is fully implemented. Most of that is from trucking. It's on the same order of magnitude as all stationary sources combined, so this is a significant source of emissions. We do know that truck and bus rule is underway. There's significant turnover of that truck fleet. There's a lot of challenges and opportunities with that right now, and how do we get that rapid turnover to get into that next generation of trucks. There are a lot of new regulations that are being proposed, and we're pushing CARB and EPA hard to develop those regulations with new truck standards, et cetera. But what we see is that even with all these new regulations, the amount of emission reductions that are estimated by 2023 are negligible. 2031 and kind of a decade out, we are seeing more significant emission reductions. It's still to be determined how much emission reduction these new regulations will provide. Want to move on to talking about the draft rule. So we've had a number of working group meetings, and I just want to walk through a little bit of the history. I mean, part of the reason this rule has taken so long is we've been really looking at a lot of different concepts and really trying to adapt to all of the comments from stakeholders. So, Originally we've been looking through the CEQA process. That's something we've been doing for years. Are there ways that we can try to address these emissions through CEQA? And that has moderate to little effect, honestly. Part of it is there's a very large existing building stock. There are limits on what land use agencies can do or are willing to do. There's a lot of competition for these warehouses, and so CEQA has some opportunities, but to address the larger issue, it's probably not the right tool. We originally had been discussing potentially some stringent measures like facility caps. Heard some concerns about that. We spent some time talking about a voluntary fleet certification concept, and we're not able to really fully bring that forward. That evolved into talking about a crediting, trading, banking system on fleet credits. We spent a fair bit of time trying to develop that concept, and we've heard from a lot of stakeholders that that's not really something that there's interest in, including from the board. And we finally have settled on this menu concept, and that's what I'm going to be spending most of the time today talking about. This menu concept is fairly similar to LEED for building design, where there's a menu of items. Each menu item has a certain number of points with it, and facilities would have to earn those points. Looking at the purpose and applicability for this rule, the purpose is, of course, to reduce emissions, but again, it's looking at both locally and regionally. There's one key word here in this purpose I want to focus on, and that's to facilitate. That this rule itself would result in emission reductions directly, but it also is looking to work with all of the other efforts and regulations that are underway from CARB and from EPA. And how do we facilitate those emission reductions? That they're statewide measures or national measures. How do we make sure that they happen here in South Coast? How do we bring those forward in time, and how do we enhance those measures? So this rule is designed to look at both what can it do on its own and how can it work together with others to really enhance those efforts. On an applicability basis, we are looking at greater than 100,000 square foot universe, so it's really that smaller fraction of facilities, although again, there are quite a few facilities that are there. I want to walk through some of these requirements. There really are, very commonly, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of leases that are out there, so you have a lot of owners, warehouse owners, and a lot of warehouse operators. The requirements are different for each. Most of the requirements in this rule are really on the operators, and I'll walk through that in a little bit. The owners are primarily just doing reporting about who their tenants are, basic site information, although the owners have an opportunity to comply on behalf of their tenants. The 5 main points that I want to walk through here are kind of the main components of the rule, and I should mention that there's still work to do on this rule, but we just want to give an update on where we are. So first, we'll talk about the menu. We'll talk about some conditions for limited transferring of points, some reporting obligations, talk about some fees, and then the thing that we've been hearing from everybody that everybody most wants to talk about is how many points would a facility need to earn, and we're still working on that, but we'll introduce that a little bit. Okay, so on the menu itself, as I mentioned, there's points associated with every menu item. These would have to be earned every year by facilities. These actions must go beyond existing regulations. There is an option if facilities choose to pay a mitigation fee instead of completing something on the menu, they could do that. The points are only required for the portion of time that an operator is at a building. So say, for example, just to put round numbers out there, maybe 10 points are required in a year for a certain facility, but if they're only there for 6 months, they would only need to get 5 points. One other detail here is that the rule applies to all industrial facilities greater than 100,000 square feet, but if it turns out, and we've seen that there are not an insubstantial number of these facilities, that they might have a building that, say, for example, is 150,000 square feet, but maybe 100,000 square feet of that is dedicated to office and manufacturing. So they only have 50,000 square feet of warehousing. There would really only be reporting requirements for that facility, and they would be more or less exempt from all the point requirements from this rule. Touching briefly on the transferring of points, and this was only added at stakeholder request. There's really 3 ways that points could be transferred. It's really quite limited, but one is, I mentioned that owners could comply on behalf of operators, and so those points would be able to be transferred between those 2 entities at a single site. Conversely, an operator might over-comply, and then if they move out, they could transfer those points back to the owner, and the owner could then transfer back to the next operator, but it all would stay at that site. The next part is that points could be banked, and so they would be able to be transferred into future years. So you might overcomply in 1 year and then be able to use that overcompliance in subsequent years, up to 3 years. And then finally, one thing we did here was that for some facilities that have multiple, some companies that have multiple facilities, they've said that, you know, if they're going to be putting in this cleaner technology, it doesn't make sense to do one truck at one facility, one charging station at another facility, and kind of one at a time everywhere. Sometimes it makes sense to go at scale at one facility. And so what we've done is we've provided this ability to go at scale at one facility and then to transfer from that overcompliance at one facility to their other facilities under their own operational control. There are some discounts for those points that would be transferred because there aren't any local benefits from that, but this is something that we have heard as a request and does seem to make sense. So calculating the value of a point can get quite complicated. There's a whole lot of different methodologies one could imagine for calculating how much is one action worth in a regulatory context. We've come up with one potential approach that really focuses on the top first on 3 main factors. 1 is the cost, 2 are the NOx reductions, those regional emission reductions, and then 3 is the local emission reductions. What we've tried to do is to simplify it, even as complicated as it is, to try to simplify it somewhat, to bin those costs, bin the emission reductions into certain points associated with each bin. And what I want to show is an example here on the bottom right. So you can imagine if there was a single action that costs, by default, we would assume that it would cost $20,000. That would get you 1 point for the costs. Similarly, that same action would provide 60 pounds of NOx reduction. That would give you 3 points from the regional emission reductions, 0.4 pounds of DPM reduction, the diesel particulate matter gets you another 2 points. So you add all that up, that single action would provide 6 points. Now then the important point we want to emphasize here is that this is all as part of the rulemaking. Individual facilities will not be doing any of this. The idea is to make this as complicated as we can up front in the rulemaking so it's as simple as possible on the back end for compliance. So we're trying to put as many details as we can here early to make that compliance easier at the end. So the draft menu as we have it right now, I'm not going to walk through this, it's pretty fine print, but it's up here on the screen. We have all these different cost points and the regional points and the local points, and those total up into the total wear points on the right side. And you can see that there's purchasing trucks and using trucks and charging infrastructure, et cetera. What the facilities are going to be looking at instead, I'm going to black out all that cost and local and regional, and they're really just going to see action points. And that's what they do. They take an action, they get a certain number of points for that action. And again, it's trying to make this as simple as possible for compliance. It's not to say that it's going to be easy. But what we should really emphasize is we have crafted this menu in this way. It's from talking to those in industry who've actually tried to implement these actions and have actually successfully implemented these or are in the process of doing it. So we believe for all facilities that at least one of these menu options is feasible. It's not easy. It will require a change of business practices, that this is something that this industry is not used to, but we do believe that these are feasible at some level for every facility. Just to touch on what this looks like in a little bit, just focusing on some of these menu items. So on the top in those blue boxes, we can see that, you know, if you acquire a Class 8 near zero emission truck, you would get 3 points in the current draft menu. But what is that? What happens when you actually use that truck? So, for example, you use it once a day for delivery at a facility, you would get 10 points. So the usage gets you more points than the actual purchase. Similarly, on a zero emission truck, you get 4 points for a Class 5. If you visit that facility once a day, you get 7 points. I do want to talk a little bit about these gray boxes at the bottom for charging infrastructure. One of the things we've heard from those facilities that have actually been installing charging infrastructure and then also talking to our partners at the utilities is that these projects often take time. It can take more than a year, sometimes more than 2 years for large installations. But with annual compliance, we wanted to make sure that if a facility is making meaningful and substantial progress, towards this kind of action, that we wanted to provide some milestones to get partial credit along the way. So we've been working with utilities to try to find what are those appropriate milestones that are shared for every single project, and we've come up with these three. One would be purchasing the charger. The next one would be starting construction, and the final one would be completing construction. And each one of those could occur in a different year. You would get that partial credit for each one of those milestones. But then if you start using that same charger, you get, as you see here, 10 points, whereas you'd only get 9 for full installation. Moving on to the reporting and notification, there are 3 primary reporting and notification components here. The first is what the owners are required to notify us about, and that's really who is their tenant and just some really basic site information. They would do that shortly after the rule is adopted, if it is adopted. And then also if there's a new operator that comes in, they have to notify us that, hey, we have a new tenant, or if they modify the building, they have to tell us that. There's also operator information that has to be submitted, and there's a first-time report that the first time they need to comply with the rule at a facility, they have to provide us some basics about, not really some basics, a little bit more detailed information about that facility. Is their charging infrastructure already in place? How much is there? Do they have a fleet? What does their fleet look like? So they have to provide that information one time, and that would be before their compliance is actually due. And then finally, their annual report that they need to submit to us would have how they earn their points every year. And they would have to provide some details on that, how they complied with the rule. All of this is going to be designed as an online web portal. We want to avoid paper everywhere possible, one that smooths the administrative burden both on facilities and ourselves. 2, it also really facilitates communicating about this program both to the public as well as to the board. We've heard that the public is very interested in how this rule is going to be implemented and what facilities are actually doing. And then we also have record-keeping requirements that records must be kept on site for 7 years. There are 2 fees that we're proposing as part of this this rule. The first is an optional fee, and that would be a mitigation fee. That if a facility decides that in any particular year they don't want to do any of the menu items, they could pay a mitigation fee. Or if they decide they only want to do some menu items, but that doesn't get to full compliance, maybe they needed 10 points, they only got 8, they could pay a mitigation fee to supplement and make up that shortfall. These fees would all be collected here at the district, and then at the board's discretion, we imagine that those funds will go right back towards incentivizing zero and near zero emission trucks, charging and fueling infrastructure for these cleaner trucks. But really the one key component is making sure that these funds go back to the areas where they were paid. And so we'll be developing that as part of this program as well. So that's an optional fee. The second fee is an administrative fee, which would be required. And then what we're proposing here is to try to address the compliance and enforcement effort. We've heard both from industry and community, how is this going to be enforced? How is compliance going to work? And so we're proposing to bring an amendment to Regulation 3 with Rule 2305, proposed Rule 2305. This would be a new rule likely under Regulation 3, and this would just cover compliance staff. We are imagining that this is going to be both an in-house auditing function as well as on-site field inspection. Moving on to rule stringency, we know that there's a lot of interest on this topic. We've really been focused up to this point on what is the structure of the rule, because that really, we need to get through that part first, because we need to understand what are the compliance options before we can think about how tight to make those options. And so we know that there's been a lot of interest in this, and the entire time we've been pushing off, but now we're going to start talking about this in a lot more detail with the working group, and then also reporting back to the board as we progress on this. I should mention that we talked about these different options. At this point, we believe that stakeholders have given us feedback that this is the best available option that is out there for ISR. It's not to say that everybody loves ISR, but this, of the options available, this seems to be one that can potentially work. The requirements for how many points a facility needs really are kind of based on 2 things. One is on the number of annual truck trips. And so facilities would have to record the number of truck trips that come in every year. They don't need to have the class of every truck or anything like that, or the make and model. They would just need to know, is it a tractor with a trailer or is it a straight truck? They would have to just give us that number. What this does is a couple of things. You can imagine if you have two 1 million square foot warehouses that are located right next to each other. One has 1,000 trips a day, another has 10 trips a day. Which one should have the higher compliance obligation? Well, the one with the more truck trips has a greater air quality impact, so this ties it much more closely to the air quality impact. Second, we've heard that the rule should try to encourage efficiency, and we've really explored this with industry. How do you fold efficiency into a rule? And it's quite difficult. We've talked about that in previous committee meetings, but this is really the primary way to do that. If a facility can figure out how to reduce the number of truck trips for their operation, then that reduces their compliance obligation. We do imagine the rule stringency will increase through time. And we're just beginning to kind of really embark on looking at this stringency. So there's kind of a different approach to this, and part of this is through board direction on looking at how do we come up with how many points a facility needs. And a lot of the rules we do here, we do a technology assessment. We look at what are our statutory requirements for reductions. Maybe there's a BACT requirement or a BART requirement. And we look at that technological assessment. We see how much those technologies cost, and we come up with a rule. The cost analysis usually comes at the end. In this case, we were directed by the board, and in many cases it makes a lot of sense for this, is to look at the cost at the exact same time that you're looking at the availability of technology, what does the air quality need, and doing all of that all at the same time. And it's more of an iterative process with each other. And so we're just embarking on that right now. What we're imagining is that this will likely first be calculated on a dollars per square foot basis, and we'll convert that into a points per truck trip basis during the rulemaking. There are a number of aspects to the economic analysis that are really important. What type of warehouse is it? How sensitive is that type of warehouse to various regulatory costs? Are they going to move out of the region? What are the real estate market conditions here? Other economic impacts, of course, there's the port complex, et cetera. We've been trying to start compiling some of the costs that industry faces already, just to try to get a sense of scale of looking at, what are the lease rates? We saw that, those have been increasing quite substantially in the last several years, and those costs have been absorbed by industry, and that's, on the order of $10 a square foot per year. Property taxes, of course, are out there, and that depends on the value of the property. You have one-time fees, of course, that are out there, and that often goes through the CEQA process. You have an air quality mitigation fee that Riverside County has been looking at for projects. So we're trying to look at all these different costs that industry faces to try to imagine how that an indirect source rule might look. And so we'll plan to report back to the board as this conversation progresses. Another really important topic we've heard is the role of incentive funding. As we've been looking at this, indirect source authority on its own does not inherently limit the use of incentive funds. What we have seen, though, is that most current incentive funding programs on their own place limits on using those funds for regulation. So that includes Carl Moyer, GGRF funds, AB 118 AQIP funds, VW Trust. All of those have either statutory or some other limits on using those funds within regulations. That's not to say there are zero funds that are available to be used within an indirect source rule. So say, for example, LCFS, that looks like, from when we've been talking to CARB staff, those funds would be available. So low carbon fuel standard credits that are given to facilities that use charging infrastructure, they should be able to use that. And that's a substantial incentive to reduce the cost of electricity or hydrogen. The utilities, some of the utilities have some infrastructure subsidies for installing infrastructure. Those should be able to be used within ISR. But again, this important one in this middle box where that red dot is, if there is a warehouse operator that owns a fleet, and that is, I should say, a minority of facilities, but if there is an operator that owns a fleet, they're going to have to make a decision. Will they use incentive funds to purchase a vehicle, or are they going to purchase that vehicle to comply with the rule in that year, or are they going to have to use some other compliance option? That said, there is an important nuance in this. A truck that is incentivized, say with Moyer, while the purchase of that truck can't be used for compliance with ISR, the usage of that truck can. We'll just have to make sure on the accounting side for emission reduction, SIP credits, we'll do that accounting, and that's up to the agencies to figure that out. But that incentivized truck can be used for ISR compliance. There are potential future funding pots that, of course, we're pursuing a lot of different ones. Both the ISR mitigation fees, those would be available if the board so decided to be used for compliance. And then also if there is, future sales tax or other sorts of funding mechanisms, depending on how those funding mechanisms are established, those potentially could be used again to comply with ISR. As you can imagine, we've gotten a lot of stakeholder feedback through this process. We expect to continue to get feedback. We have heard, just a quick summary here, wanting to accelerate rule implementation and phase-in. We've heard some real fears from the warehouse industry about, they're really worried that the costs are going to be too high. We've heard from many folks that they want to ensure that this rule has SIP creditable emission reduction targets, and we really need to be focusing on that. A quick note on that again, the purpose of this rule is to both get those SIP creditable emission reductions, but then to also facilitate, right? How do we facilitate and enhance other programs, other regulations that are in place? And so some of those may not be SIP creditable to this rule, but they are SIP creditable at the end of the day and are actual improvements to air quality. We've also heard about wanting to have more options for near zero technologies, and then at the same time remove all options for near zero technologies. And so that debate continues in this rulemaking. We have heard about trying to ensure that ISR accounts for these nearby sensitive populations. And one of the main ways that we have done this, which was a change from how we've been thinking about this for at least a year, was to include this local component in the points. And how do we include local DPM reductions as part of those points? So that's the main way that we've done it. We've been hearing some feedback. Are there other ways to try to make the rule more stringent for warehouses close to sensitive populations? We're still looking at that, but we continue to get that feedback. We've also heard that the mitigation fee should be higher than the cost of implementing the WARE menu. That's one thing that we are taking a look at. We're contemplating right now that the mitigation fee would be set at essentially the same level as sort of default actions within the menu. We've also heard that some facilities are taking early action. They're taking action today. We don't want the rule to limit those early actions or to have facilities wait because they want to make sure that anything they do gets credit in ISR. So we're trying to take a look at that and what can be done with the rule there. And then, as I've mentioned several times, how does all the other policy actions that are occurring on trucks, how does that intersect with ISR? And that's one thing that we're keeping in front of our minds. Final slide. So what's coming up next? We plan to spend a lot of effort working on this rule stringency, talking to the working group. We've heard a lot of requests also for additional detailed information about how we're coming up with evaluation of the WARE points for each menu item. We are working on that draft write-up. We hope to release that as soon as we can, ideally within the next week or so, but we are trying to pull that together too. The CEQA analysis is underway for this rule. This is a substantial program, and it will be a substantial CEQA analysis that's going to take time. We don't want to get that wrong, but we'll be working on that as well. We're continuing to meet with the working group to complete the draft rule, all the supporting documentation, and then we also are currently planning to bring an update to the full governing board at the March meeting. With that, I'll conclude my presentation and we'll go over for comments.
You're on mute, Dr. Berg.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm sure we have a number of speakers both at CC8 and here at the Lux Hotel. Ms. Mitchell, do you have some cards there, or people who would like to speak on this item?
I do. I have, let's see, quite a few here. It's like maybe 6 cards here.
Okay. You want to start calling those people?
What about those two?
Yes, okay.
Those were the first time, okay.
All right.
You're good.
Pretty clear. Okay,
And there's
Angie Balderas.
good.
That's not a microphone.
No?
Just, yeah, tuck it back in, thanks. The mic's
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
So I guess I just have to use my
The
organizer.
little one, right in
All
front
right.
of you.
We call them the candy bar mics.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No, just
That-
leave it right on top there.
All right. Man, you got a lot of rules. That's kind towards the industry. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Angie Balderas. I'm not only a Sierra Club organizer, I'm also a resident of Highland. And I'm here once again. I've been living in the inland region for over 20 years. I'm here once again not only to encourage y'all to do the right thing by community, but do it with urgency. As someone who's seen her community and children and seniors dying and fighting respiratory issues every day all around her, I say we cannot wait any longer. Please do not delay any further and vote on this rule by May 20th. Trust, these developers who are moving into my neighborhoods and the San Bernardino around the airport and Highland, they just sold another 22 acres to another developer for a fulfillment center. The gas and fossil fuel industry, they are not pushing back their dates to build more warehouses and to bring more trucks. I'm just here to say enough is enough. Like, give us folks in the IE a break, because our elected officials, our city council, our board of supervisors, they're giving these folks a green light to use their weapon, which is pollution, to kill us. And the urgency that I'm seeing is just, come live with me so you can see. I have an extra room. You're all welcome to come and breathe our air. Please help our community. It's about time, as they say. Ya basta. Thank you.
What's magic about the 25th of May?
May 1st. The board meeting?
Oh, I thought you said the 20th.
May
I thought you
2020,
said
the
the
year.
25th.
Sorry, sir. May 1st.
Oh,
For the board meeting.
okay,
I'll see you then.
okay, gotcha.
Next person.
Next person is Carlo De La Cruz.
So good morning, everyone. Good morning, Chair Burke and members of the committee. Welcome to the first Mobile Source Committee of 2020. We made it. Feels a lot like 2019. But I hope you're enjoying today's air. Today you can see the Angeles Mountains, which is not a common sight. I will keep my comments short today. We've been involved in this process. We want to thank both the staff and the work that's been involved. We've come a long way, and we really see the rules starting to take shape, and it's starting to become something that we can finally stand up and say, we want to see this change in our communities. We want to see this type of rule be adopted by the board. We want to see these implementations being done. Vast majority of what we're seeing in the rule are things that I can personally support. And the letter today is submitted in coalition with our partner organizations and includes recommendations on how to further strengthen the rule so we can even be more proud and more vocal about our support for it. So on behalf of the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice, Earth Justice, East Yards for Community for Environmental Justice, the Sierra Club, Teamsters Local 1932, the Warehouse Worker Resource Center, San Pedro Peninsula Homeowners Coalition, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, we'd like to formally submit this letter, also via email, to the Mobile Source Committee for recommendations on how to improve the warehouse ware ISR as it currently is. Again, thank you. We know this is a long road ahead. We also want to really encourage you to maintain the current timeline in trying to get this rule finalized and adopted by the May deadline. We know that this is a really busy year. We know that AQMD cannot do it alone. You are acting in coordination with your other agencies, your other air districts. And we also know that CARB, as well as other agencies like the ports, are also considering important electric trucks and zero emission advancement policies. So really, when Ian described this as being a facilitation rule, I really see that as the full potential, really being able to facilitate the advanced clean truck rule that CARB is currently considering, the transportation refrigeration unit rule that CARB is currently considering, the locomotives rule, many, many other rules, and also helping out our partners at the ports, as well as helping out the warehouses and developers who already want to go in this direction. We've seen the urgency of the climate crisis. In the words of the students who who walked out with Greta Thunberg in honor of that climate crisis. We've seen a lot of baby steps. What we need now are big boy steps or big girl steps. We need adult steps. We need ambitious steps. And so it is now 2020. I want to thank you to the new year. I want to thank our new board, our new council member to the committee as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Peter Herzog. Peter.
Good morning. My name is Peter Herzog with NAB. Happy New Year to everybody. I guess we'll see a lot of each other. As you recall, we spoke at the October board meeting indicating that there were an awful lot of questions, few answers, and a lot of work to be done, and that everything was very conceptual. Well, since October, we've had a lot more words, but it remains conceptual. There's really no clear substance that faces to go to. We have no idea of how many emissions reductions you could get. There's still no analysis on SIP. There's still no analysis on costs. Even though it was indicated the draft was released in November, the staff is on your presentation specifically indicates that draft is conceptual. That was released in November. We're here in January, and they specifically indicate in the presentation that the stringency and other details still are in development. So again, we're still in, and as far as the where points, those were released in December of 2010. At that time, we were told specifically in the meeting they were conceptual as well. There's been no additional information since. So again, all the information before you shows that what we've been doing is a lot of discussion, yet everything is still incredibly conceptual, and there's no way to fully analyze its impact in any way, shape, or form. I would want to address one comment that was made on slide 14 that the stakeholders generally agree that this is the best concept. That is just not true. I think it's clear from the questions we have raised over time, the numerous questions that come up in the meetings, that no one is, there is certainly not uniform or general agreement on this approach. There are numerous questions and issues to be addressed. Nothing is clear, and there is clearly not consensus. And in fact, what has come out since October actually raises more questions. In the stringency, it sets a 5-point cap. So what you have is a situation where an industry could put in $2 million or $150,000 and only get 5 wear points. So what you're creating is a disincentive to go to do any more aggressive or larger project, because the focus is not going to be on decreasing emissions, but merely compliance. I don't think a rule for compliance sake is the one you want to have. And finally, as was noted clearly, on the incentive side of things, you have major incentive programs. These are the programs that are the focus of your effort to try to turn over the truck fleets. And that is the major purpose of this rule. And yet what has been indicated, and is definitely legally true, is that you're now going to, if you adopt this rule, limit the use of those incentives. Limit the ability for the tools you do have to be able to be used. That seems to be very contradictory and goes against what you really are trying to achieve. And is that something you really want to do? Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.
The next one is Justice. I think it's Sandoval.
Hi, so my name is Justice Sandoval, and I'm a site coordinator for an after-school program where more than half of my 120 students have asthma or allergies. I know of 3 high school students in my community to have cancer, and unfortunately we lost 2 this past year. I myself have extreme allergies, and as my doctor has said, the lungs of a 50-year-old smoker at 21. I'm tired of struggling to breathe. I want to breathe, I want my students to breathe, and I want a healthy community. You, the Air District, have the power to enforce these rules that does not favor natural gas over our health. You have the power to hold these warehouses accountable for the damages that they've done to my people, and you have the power to give us our breath back. So please do not let us down, and thank you.
Thank you. Next, Thomas Jelinek. Did I say it right? It's Jelinek?
It's Thomas Yelich.
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 Okay.
Thank you. Good morning. Thomas Yelich with PMSA representing marine terminals and ocean carriers in California. I'd like to first I'd like to echo Peter Herzog's comments. The comments Peter made are comments that I strongly agree with, and I think also reflect the views of the maritime industry. But more specifically, we're concerned about three specific areas. One is on integration. This program needs to be integrated ultimately with what's going on with the ports MOU. We still don't know, consistent with Peter's comments about things being conceptual, we don't know how this program is going to work with the ports MOU. It's important to remember that we have a single logistics system. It's not just ports, it's not just warehouses, it's a logistics system. The trucks that start in the port, end at the warehouses, go to the rail yards. Any regulatory program needs to work consistently across all of these facilities. Otherwise, it risks impacting our ability to be competitive when it comes to bringing cargo through our ports, through our warehouses. In fact, the San Pedro Bay ports for 2019 are down 3%, more than 3% last year. So our industry is not robust. In fact, we are in long-term market share decline, and so we need to make sure we don't create regulatory hurdles for our long-term competitiveness. Second, I wanted to mention also on incentive funds. As you know, the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles are about to engage in the next generation of the Clean Trucks program. Incentive funds are going to be very important. So regulatory efforts that limit access to incentive funds are going to compromise not just the ability of this region to get to clean air, but also in our local communities. And I'm particularly concerned about the staff's conclusion that the use of incentive funds are consistent with that you may not be able to receive compliance for the purchase of a truck with incentive funds, but you could use an incentivized trucks for compliance. Incentive programs have specific use requirements. This regulation has specific use requirements. I think we need to be absolutely certain on this, and we can't be at the 11th hour and find out later that these incentivized trucks will not meet the compliance requirements of any regulation that AQMD puts forward. It would be a step backward both for AQMD and for our ports. Finally, I also want to echo the point on emission reductions. We don't have any information on emission reductions, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony.
Next, we have Court Smith.
Looks like my grandson.
Good morning. I'm one of the co-coordinators of the Inland Empire Sunrise Movement Hub, which is a youth-led climate justice group. And I was also born in San Bernardino, and I've lived in the inland region most of my life. And I'm also now working in a warehouse in San Bernardino. We're very excited about the potential for this indirect sources rule to protect the health of our communities. And I want to thank you all for your hard work on this rule so far. But we are also concerned about some of the developing details of this rule that indicate it may not be implemented in a way that will substantially protect our community members. We do not support rewards for building fossil fuel combustion trucks and infrastructure, including refueling stations and gas infrastructure. In addition, money gathered from the mitigation fee must not support gas projects. This money should only support growth of zero emissions projects only. Investment and support for gas rewarded in this rule will continue to hurt our communities. The Air District could be a leader in protecting our communities and supporting the growing movement to zero emissions if zero emissions infrastructure, trucks, and equipment are the only solutions incentivized in this ISR. In addition, The current menu of investment items doesn't include designated on-site resting areas for truck drivers that would also prevent those truck drivers from having to idle in nearby communities. We please request that you would consider adding this option for the benefit that it would bring to our communities. In addition, I'm concerned about the point transfer and would like to note that if the point transfer occurs, we want this process to be transparent and to include different methods for facilities in sensitive areas like next to homes and schools. The timing of this rule has been delayed several times, and our communities cannot afford to keep waiting for it. So please do not delay any further, and I hope that you're able to vote on this rule by May 2020. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony.
I have one more speaker. It's Andrea Vidora. Did I say it right?
You did. Yeah, you're doing good today. Hi, everybody. My name is Andrea Vidaurre. I'm with the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice. We're a community-based organization working in the Inland Empire, working really with the residents that are frontline to many of these warehouses that this rule would impact. I'm looking through this presentation. I just have a couple comments on different parts of it. One of them, we're talking about stringency. I just want to echo that is the most important part of this rule. We need to go back and be able to tell our communities that this agency is going to be able to.
I know that. Yeah. I'm like, we need to get all the details.
Oh.
Can you put your mute on, please?
Sorry. I'm going to keep going. So the stringency is the most important part because I need to go back and be able to tell my communities that this agency is going to be able to make up for all of the bad planning that has happened all over the region. Many of you have been to our communities. Many of you know that they're not respecting the 1,000-foot buffer. They're putting these things every single place that they can. I mean, at this point, we're not even just talking about open land for us to recreate in. We're talking about literally they're displacing homes and they're dislocating people. And they're trying to dislocate schools, and they're just interrupting neighborhoods in general. So this rule is really about making up for that, and hopefully in the future making sure that these warehouses aren't coming into the areas that they're not supposed to, and if they do, they understand that the compliance is high and that they shouldn't be doing this. I need to be able to go back to my community members and the residents that live in this area and be able to tell them at what point will their neighbor be zero emission? At what point will they be able to know that the trucks going in and out, the infrastructure being used, the warehouse in general is the cleanest absolute possible and it's zero emission? Because at this point, every single day they're breathing in the pollution that comes in and out of these warehouses. And, we don't really have enough time, right? Just as we speak, we have schools of children that have to breathe this in and families that have to deal with this. So, we're excited that this rule is moving along and that we'll be able to get to a place where we're looking at a zero emission logistics industry. I do want to be clear that there's a couple points. The operator may transfer excess points to another facility under its control. I just want to be clear that discount must be enough to disincentivize operators from using that option. Especially, I don't think it's an option that should be available if the warehouse is in a DAC community, a term that the state has written out what it means, which is above the 80th percentile for Cal EnviroScreen. We really appreciate, I'm just going to use 30 more seconds since that all happened. I really appreciate the fact that we are only using electric infrastructure and we're only giving points to that. But
I'm sorry, but your time is up. Your time is up.
Okay.
She has that delay.
There was a delay because of the sound.
Oh, you did? I did.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay, there's more time. All right.
Okay, just
go.
Yeah. Thank you.
Wind it up then.
Yeah. No, we really appreciate that there's only points given to the electrification infrastructure, but that's not enough to really signal the industry, the manufacturers, and the operators that we're trying to go into a direction of zero emission. And so we are asking that points are differentiated between the usage of near zero and zero emission. We need to start, this is part of that signal to the manufacturers. We're not going to just wait for them to do it, right? We need to set a demand from these communities. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Does that conclude the testimony in CCA?
I just wanted to, okay. Sorry, I forgot to sign myself up. I was like helping everybody else get signed
Oh,
up.
okay, it's Yasi, I don't have your last name, but it's Yasi
Kavazadeh.
You already testified, so on item 1, right? So we'll take one more.
Okay, just really quick, I want to just echo all the comments. I don't want to repeat what the comments of my colleagues said. I just want to touch on the fear that was echoed by folks from the industry. That to us is not happening on the front lines of the inland region. We're seeing growth, and actually, as we've seen, it's only going to get bigger. We're only going to have more people consuming. The trade, international trade right now, as we all know, is expanding, and we're planning on expanding. So this rule actually is a preventative measure that is going to save lives for generations to come. And that might be a hard pill to swallow for industry in the beginning for them, because it's a change of how they run things. But I just want to squash that fear, and that a lot of the growth that's happening in commerce isn't going to go away. I don't need to name all the things that are happening in the market right now for you all to understand that. And the time and money and cost it has on our lives outweigh the time and money that industries invest in their business models and in their practices. So as this agency, as much pushback as you get from the disincentivization of wear points, or the fact that incentives are hurting, will hurt the industry in this way and will benefit the industry in that way, that to us isn't backed by data and science in the fact that our public health is in danger. And we are not close to reaching attainment at all in this district. So that was the point. This is the point of my comment, is just to remind y'all that we appreciate all the work and feedback that we've gathered, but it's time to really do our job in your jobs to get this rule passed. It's been way too long. We've been advocating for years now. We're not going to stop. I mean, hopefully we'll still be here, but at the same time, we want to pivot towards solutions. So we hope that this rule can pivot us in that direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's it for here.
I had time left, she just got another 3 minutes, 3 minutes.
You already spoke.
I got 3 minutes, she just got 3, I had 25 seconds left.
Madam Chair, I think he did have a few, I remembered it as 20, but it could be 25. I think he did have
25 seconds left on his 3 minutes.
Come on, Harvey.
All right.
Come on. We spent a half hour arguing about 25 seconds.
All right, okay, Harvey Eder, for myself, etc. Okay, I'm incorporating by reference a study done by UC Berkeley Professor Ron Cohen the last couple of months that said use satellites to look down on NOx. That's what we're talking about here, okay? That the numbers are way off, maybe 10, 50% more or 100% more. This is to be incorporated by reference to this. Everything's knocked off. Okay, these are real numbers. We hadn't looked at this before. Oh, wait, what percentage of people own homes in that area? It has to be studied. Home ownership vouchers, rent to own. We're doing this in LA, dealing with Rabbi Farkas, the LA County and City Housing Commission. So we got to look at this, and that can be leveraged into buying into these co-ops, to buying the solar or the trucks and partnerships to do this and implement it. Okay. Using the low carbon fuel standard is outrageous. This is taking money from solar electric vehicles and putting into natural. 200 buses in Santa Monica get from a landfill in Texas garbage. They call it renewable natural gas. It's got drug resistant antibiotics and something that is being totally ignored as part of the solar. There's other things, but I should be able to get, like she got 3 minutes. So.
Actually, on this, Harvey, I happen to agree with you. But when I suggested the satellite analysis, everybody looked at me like I had a hole in my head.
Like
so,
the brain thing.
I'm trying, but It's a tough battle, man.
We gotta keep on keeping
Okay,
on.
that concludes our testimony in CC8. Supervisor Bartlett, do you have any testimony in your location?
I have no testimony, but I do have some questions.
Okay, we'll get to those. I have two new friends here at the Lux Hotel, and I'm going to let Ethan and
Ethan Svetanek.
Okay.
Hi, I'm just here as a concerned individual living in Los Angeles for over 3 years now. Emissions reductions is not adequate. Residents have endured toxic air quality in the South Coast Air Basin for decades, and it still does not meet federal or state standards. And a long-term reduction in the pollution that doesn't result in zero emissions prioritizes profit over human life. Near zero emissions is just delaying a public health crisis that gets worse every single day. And we can't afford to delay any longer. I'm aware that change is expensive, but the Air District is sharing the cost of complying with the rule. So the only real hurdle is the hassle of updating equipment and operation strategies under an enforced timeline. And my health is worth the hassle. So I hope you take that into consideration. Thank you.
You're up to bat. Your name for the record?
Hi, everybody. My name's Francis. I'm an organizer with the Sierra Club. I just really want to echo everything that's already been said by our friends out in Diamond Bar. I think what we're really here to talk about is not just about some difficult transition that industry has to bear so that it can keep its profit margins high and that the port gets to run really smoothly and we all get to enjoy free 2-day shipping or something. I think what we're really here to talk about is a climate crisis in which Australia has been burning for over 2 weeks, has lost 1 billion animals, as well as California has just suffered the worst fire year of its life in known history. And to make it more local, that folks out in San Bernardino, as individuals and organizers have said, are literally dying. That people on the west side of Long Beach next to the port and logistics centers are literally dying. That my friends who are teachers at a middle school in Long Beach are watching their kids get nosebleeds and lose school days every single year because there's no action. And that if we're really going to be talking about the difficulty of struggling to make zero emissions of the future, then all we're really talking about is how we can be more accommodating to the very industries that have been killing us and the planet in the first place. And to me, that's just injustice being perpetuated again. So I don't want to take any more time because I think that everybody's been saying exactly what I support, which is that zero emissions is what we need and zero emissions is what we need right now. I just hope that you really do take our comments into consideration because it's not like we want to be coming out here every Friday morning to do this. We're doing this because this is the only way we know how to advocate for ourselves. So thank you for your time, and I hope that we move forward in the right direction.
Thank you very much for your testimony. It was very cogent. I'm going to Supervisor Bartlett, who has some questions down Orange County.
Great. Thank you so much, Chairman Burke. And I know that the staff has put a lot of time and effort into the presentation, and I appreciated all of the information that they're bringing forth today. And you know, I'm relatively new to AQMD and still drinking out of that fire hose of trying to get all the information and digest it. But I know that over the years, we've made a significant difference in the air quality. So, you know, I worked in the Irvine Spectrum in the mid 1980s. And at that time, we've had substantial growth of development and more people moving into the county. And I remember I was, at that point, an executive in the private sector, and I was instructing a potential candidate to interview to turn towards the mountains when she got off the freeway and come into the office. And she called me and she said, "I can't see any mountains." And this was in the mid-'80s. And the air quality at that time was really poor. And between the mid-'80s and where we are right now, we've had substantial growth with more development, people moving into the county, but the air quality is substantially better. Today, you can see the mountains, and that's a significant difference into, you know, the great work that the AQMD has done over the years in improving the air quality in the basin. So in looking at this particular item and trying to digest all of the information and just kind of a cursory look at things. I'm looking at the current approach relative to incentives. And when you take a look out, caps out at the $100,000 level, to me, it looks like people are going to try to potentially game the system because they don't get anything in addition by expending anything more than $100,000 relative to the actual wear points that are received. And I think it's imperative that the wear reductions are SIP creditable, and facilities should receive credit for pre-roll actions. And I think that was mentioned by one of the speakers. Also, one of the challenges, and it was noted by staff, that you've got the owners of the property, you've got the operators, and most of the operators do not own their fleet. They're in the minority, so they don't control the trucks that come into their facilities because they don't own the trucks. So that's an area of concern that I have. And then relative to the incentives, so most of the existing sources of funding place limits on using funds to comply with the particular regulation. And right now, the emphasis is on the incentive funding, which has been a major factor for truck fleet turnover and for reducing emissions. And so if we move away from a really highly incentivized program on incentives to something else, that gives me a little pause for concern. So one slide that was presented, even if we're able to program the ISR mitigation fees, I'm concerned that it will be counterintuitive to some of the great work that we've done via incentive funding. And if that's the case, perhaps do we steer clear of the ISR rule for an industry that's heavily engaged in incentive funding? So I want staff to speak to that particular item at this point. And then I have another question on emissions.
Supervisor, this is Philip Fun. I could speak to the incentives, and it was brought up by a couple of the speakers, and it was characterized as limiting incentives. First of all, we want to clarify, it does not limit incentives. If you are subject to this rule as a warehouse operator, and you don't own your fleet, you're in the same situation you are now, because you would not be eligible for those incentives because you don't have your own fleet. If you happen to own your fleet, then yes, you will have a choice. You can still use those incentives, but you will not be given points for the purchase of that truck if you use the incentives. If you'd rather have the points, you have the points. So one way to look at it is limiting what you can do, but another way to look at it is we're actually providing more incentives. We have not raised the amount of money we need to turn over the entire fleet. We don't have the dollars. You could look at this as providing additional incentives, additional options in the form of points to comply with the rule in case we have not raised $1 billion or $2 billion a year to completely turn over the truck fleet through incentives. So it's not really limiting, it's adding, in a sense, another incentive, another option, because until we've actually raised that money, we are oversubscribed. And any way we can get people to take those actions to purchase that cleaner truck in the absence of enough funding to do so, I think it's a good policy.
Phil, if I could just interject. So Supervisor, in a way, this is an issue of what I would call stacking. And I say it in that way because I know this is the way that ARB has approached it. ARB is the one who has said to us that the utilization of Carl Moyer funds, in essence, can't be double dipped. You can't get access to Carl Moyer funds and then get access to the other program. But we still get to use the benefits of the investment through the Carl Moyer program through ongoing operation. So I really just wanted to emphasize what Dr. Fine said, and that is we're not limiting access to the incentive funds. We're following state guidelines, and we're creating opportunities to use those incentive funds in new and novel applications.
And if I could just add one more thing. We know that it's less than 20% of the trucks that are servicing these warehouses are owned by the warehouses. That other 80% is owned by other fleets servicing the warehouses, and they would have full access to the incentive programs, Moyer and others.
Okay, I guess one of my concerns is that even with the incentive program, looking at the truck fleet turnover in order to be compliant, at least in the short term, how do you think that's going to affect the goods movement industry, and, in the cost of doing business and the price of consumer products, looking for a bit of a balance there?
Yeah, I think you're talking about, we don't know yet until we've developed the stringency of the rule, meaning how many what is your actual point obligation annually. So that's the next step. Once we do that, we'll be able to assess those impacts to the industry.
Okay, thank you. With regard to the AQMD, I know that the San Joaquin Valley Air District and the Air District won relative to regulating the effects of vehicles, et cetera, and kind of what we're looking towards. But their rule was geared towards new development and didn't apply to existing development. So can you opine on that relative to what
yes.
we're trying to achieve?
Absolutely. So that's absolutely true. They're looking at new development, and there's a couple reasons that that's not necessarily included in what we're proposing here. Although new development would be subject to the rule, just like existing facilities. So first, in order to get more emission reductions, if you only apply this rule to new facilities, you're only affecting the new facilities, and you're pretty much ignoring the existing building stock. You can get a lot more benefits by looking at existing building stock. So we acknowledge this is not the same approach that San Joaquin took. Second, the way that San Joaquin has implemented the rule, it is essentially performance standards for these developments, and pretty much each development requires an analysis and a plan, and it has essentially turned into the developers paying a mitigation fee to the district if they have not met those standards. And the number of projects they have in San Joaquin is much, much, much less than the number of projects we have here. If we did something similar for new development, we would need a staff of, I don't know how many, but it might be a new building to review all these plans coming in, to audit those, to make sure each one is individually approved and how much is owed. And it doesn't seem practical for an area that has, hundreds of projects a month versus, the handful that San Joaquin has a month. So there's several reasons why we took this approach. I think the number one is we don't want to ignore the opportunities in the existing square footage of warehouses and wait for everything to catch up 10, 20 years from now with all of the new buildings coming in, because we don't have the time to wait for those benefits.
Okay, thank you for your clarification. And then my last question has to do with just the general concern relative to emissions and what we hope to achieve. And I know right now it's a little bit unclear, but do you have virtually any kind of estimates or extrapolations with regard to what this IRS rule would do relating to the achievement of both relative to NOx and the diesel particulate matters?
Again, until we develop the stringency proposal, we can't do that. Once we do that, we're going to have to make a lot of assumptions, because we can't be sure which option on the menu is going to be chosen by how many facilities. We will make some rough estimates of what we think will happen, and we will provide that. Some of that will be SIP creditable. Some of it will not be SIP creditable, because again, putting in a charging infrastructure does not in itself provide emission reductions, although it's an action that we need to absolutely occur to facilitate those. So it's a little complicated, but until we get to stringency, it's very hard to talk about the scale of the emission reductions and the SIP credit.
Okay, but because you're even bringing this forth for consideration, I'm assuming that you would anticipate there would be some benefit. You don't know to what level, but you're anticipating that there would be some net benefit. Is that correct?
Yes, and maybe we'll have a little more information in March when we report back to the full board, but if not, we'll be reporting back to committee. I want to talk about timing a little bit. We've heard from testimony that they want this to be considered in May. If it wasn't for a potentially extensive CEQA analysis, that would be possible. I think it's going to be a challenge because, again, for something so controversial, we need to make sure our CEQA document is defendable. So, we're going to do our best, but we'll see how the next working group goes. But we may have to come back and talk about timing at some point.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much.
Ms. Mitchell, do you have any comments?
I have a few questions and comments. One thing that was mentioned was the use of LCFS. And generally LCFS produces a credit for the low carbon fuel that the owner is using. Can you elaborate a little bit on how we would incorporate it into this program?
So LCFS would largely be ignored within the context of the regulation, but the facility operator, they would, if they have a charging station, for example, that they installed, and they were using that charging station, that would satisfy their compliance, for example. But they would be able to offset the cost of that by receiving LCFS credits. So the cost of compliance would be cheaper to the facility operator by using LCFS. But within the context of the rule, we are silent on it. If LCFS is available, great, go ahead and use it. Or other incentive funds that might be available, but we will be silent.
Okay, that
They get
helps
10
me.
times the market rate, like $100 a ton.
And the other thing is verification. It's all self-reported. And so one thing that you have in here is the local emission reductions. And we think I think we should be able to tie that to the idling situations we have in our impacted communities. But how would we go about verifying what's actually happening and what kind of reductions we're getting?
It's a great question. That's one of the things that we've been hearing the whole time is how would this rule be enforced? How does compliance work? So that is why we are trying to build in that there is a new compliance function that's going to be needed at the district. This is a new substantial program with a lot of facilities, so we imagine we are going to have a new compliance program. Part of that is desktop audits. That doesn't really help you find out what's happening out there. So there's certain kinds of records we will require to be reported to us with some details that we feel that we have some comfort with what information is being reported, but then it's also field inspections, going out and seeing what's happening on the ground. Now then, that doesn't mean we're going to be able to have an inspector every day at every site. That's just an impossible task. But to be able to go out and see what's happening on the ground and look at even more detailed records that the facility has. So we are trying to make sure that enforcement, there is sufficient resources that are provided to provide a meaningful, equitable enforcement program.
I'm wondering if we can't in some way incorporate our 617 communities who are all concerned about idling, maybe as sort of a pilot, and maybe have some of those members of those communities actually help us with the monitoring and and notifying us when they're seeing excess idling in their communities, sort of as a pilot demonstration of how we might be able to enforce it. So you get a credit for purchase of, say, a charging station or a truck, but then you get a credit for using it. And is the credit one, so the truck comes into the warehouse, the clean truck. So is that point given to that truck for its one-time call on that warehouse, or suppose it calls on more than one warehouse? I mean, these are all very detailed things that we're going to have to work out. I'm just wondering, is the use one time a day, or is it one time when, over what period of time?
So this will be looking annually, so how many truck trips come annually, and it's the points are not given to the fleet, the points are given to the warehouse operator. If a truck comes to the facility, they would record that, and they would get credit for that one visit. If that same truck goes to the warehouse next door, that other warehouse next door also gets a point for that visit. And so they will just tally up how many visits they get every year. It could be 300 in 1 month or 300 spread out over a year, whatever it is. So it goes to the operator.
We don't really know what kind of reductions we're going to get. There was an estimate on one of the slides on page 8 of 43 tons of NOx.
The 43 was the total stationary.
That was stationary, and 37 tons and mobile, which
Right.
gives us 80. How accurate is that sort of estimate?
Let me, I think I confused that a little bit for folks. So the 43 tons per day is the total stationary source NOx inventory in 2023. So all the refineries, power plants, that's all just as a way of comparison.
Okay.
In comparison, the warehouses, the first estimate we have is it's about 37 tons per day and the total universe of warehouses. So any reduction would be off of that 37 tons per day. We're still working on what that reduction is going to be. We'll definitely be reporting back.
Okay. So that's kind of a window into what we think we might get out of this.
It's what's available to get.
But what I want to add is there's a lot of CARB regulations that are coming forward that are also eating away at that 37 tons a day. You can't double count. That's going to be something we have to figure out. But we hope to be able to go beyond, get something beyond what the CARB regulations are going to get.
And bring it earlier if possible.
And bring it earlier, yeah.
And I just noticed that in your list, this draft menu, I didn't see any reference to hydrogen fueling.
Yes, it's there.
Is it in there?
Yes, it's
Okay.
fine print, but it's there.
All right, okay. And then one of our speakers referenced how this program would be coordinated with the port's clean air action plans and their clean truck rules that are coming out. Are we looking at that? Are we talking with them about
Absolutely.
this?
So one way to think of this is there are going to be many regulations addressing the same source. It sounds confusing, but it's actually not unusual. So if you think about what CARB is working on, for say advanced clean trucks, right? It's a manufacturer mandate on sales. They're also working on fleet rules. So the owners of the trucks are going to have certain requirements. And then what we're working on is the destinations. So every step of the way, the regulations and a push and a pull to help the same thing happen, right? So you can view the port truck program, if it is significant, that is another destination-based potential incentive. So we want to get it from every angle, and it's not unusual for regulations to apply to different areas of that chain. So they have to work together. We want to make sure they're coordinated, and we want to make sure they complement each other. But it's not at first blush like something that you don't want to do. It's something that actually can work.
And then the other thing that you did mention in your slides was that the point system will be accelerated. So you start at 1 year that required to get a certain number of points, and then the next year that goes up. I mean, is that what the plan is? So that you're always progressing?
Yeah, we do believe that we're going to have a built-in schedule of increasing stringency through time. And part of that is just what technology is available through time. We can't require 100% zero emissions today if it doesn't exist, right? So try to look at that technology availability and build that up through time, especially also as costs keep coming down on these technologies.
And then we touched on this, but realistically, what do you think is the timeline to bring this rule to the board?
And again, a full CEQA EIR, which we think we'll have to do, which is started on, has a minimum time frame of, we have the 75-day requirements, but comments, we'll get a lot of comments responding. We're looking at, we don't know yet. We don't know what kind of CEQA document we are, but May will be challenging if we have to do a full CEQA document. So, mid-year is still, the hope.
Okay. That's all I have, Chairman.
Well, I think I'm entering either my 28th or 29th year here at the district. And there's one way I can always tell whether a rule is either a great rule or a horrible rule. It's by the number of people who contact me about the rule. And on this rule, I've heard from people I haven't heard from for 20 years. So I know that this rule is going to have impact in either a very positive or a very negative way. I'd like to vote on this rule by May. I'd like to see it go up or down in May. But the problem is that Supervisor Bartlett asked 2 questions, and then Dr. Fine, your answer simplified was, I'm working on it. Right or wrong?
That's right.
That's correct. We don't disagree with the commenters.
So how can you expect people who are involved with this rule, on both sides, to really evaluate the merit of the rule until they know what the rule really is. So, you know, when you start kind of dancing on May, I understand that because this is a very complex rule. So I know people want to hurry up and get it passed, and nobody wants to get it passed more than I do to get it off my plate. But I think you need to do it right. And I, you know, I have the highest regard for your professionalism. So, you know, I think you have some more work to do with both sides of this issue. That's the end of my epistle. Okay, is that it? Thank you very much for your, by the way, your presentation was excellent. I understood some issues that I've been arguing with Wayne about, which I didn't fully understand, but now I do. So thank you very much for that.
That could be helpful.
Okay, item 3.
Dr. Burke, this is Barbara.
Dr. Fine. I'm sorry?
Yes, this is Barbara. Before we go on to the next item, could I explain something for the benefit of committee members?
Sure.
So, committee members, Mr. Etter had pointed out that we allowed one of the other speakers to speak twice. And I just wanted to explain to the committee members that the reason for that was that I neglected to state at the beginning of the meeting that the 3-minute limit would apply to the entire calendar other than public comment. So what I plan to do is modify the agenda format so that the agenda will make it very clear to everybody who plans to testify that the 3-minute limit would apply to all the items other than public comment. So I wanted to explain that in case the board members were wondering why we allowed that.
You know, Barbara, I'm not, I don't know if I agree with you on that one because, you know, there's some important issues that come up on agenda, and that means if I speak on one, I can't speak on another, right?
Well, it's up to the committee. If you don't want to have that rule, then we won't have it.
Okay.
We can leave it at 3 minutes per item.
I'll check with my other lawyer, Miss Mitchell there, and she'll tell me what to say. She'll tell me what to say.
Great.
Okay. Moving on to rule. Moving on to item 3.
So Dr. Burke,
Dr.
items 3 and 4 are just written reports, no motion required.
Okay. Okay, is there any other business before the committee this morning? We heard a lot, that's for sure. How about public comment? Harvey?
Yeah. Hello, I'm Harvey Etter. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition. And, okay, history. 4 or 5 years ago, there were like 90 cases against the fossil fuel industry, almost all by government, to litigate. The principle has been laid down and cited by Naomi Klein. It's basically, if you broke it, you fix it. That's law, okay? They broke our ecosystem. 200-300 years burning fossil fuels. They knew about this stuff 150 years ago when they were choosing the fuels for vehicles. They didn't do nothing about it. Edison was saying, oh, solar and wind. They didn't do nothing, okay? They're gonna pay for it, okay? This entity, the state of California, and the federal government ought to be part of this litigation. They're gonna pay for it. All income the next 10 years from fossil fuels as we phase it out into a trust fund, a public health balance fund. We can start right here in the IEM in the district around with these warehouses. When people are damaged, their health, when they die, they got asthma, they got out-of-pocket costs, it could be supported by this fund. Also for other damages, okay? This needs to be done ASAP right now. Talk to Bloomberg and the candidates. It has to be part of what's going on now. Okay, so this is really important. The stuff with the low carbon fuel standard, instead of $10, $15 a ton, it's $100, $150, $200 a ton. Okay, they're wiping out solar. They're using drug-resistant antibiotics, antifungals and stuff from waste sites and putting it into the distribution system is totally ignored by the powers that be, you folks. This is bad stuff. I said there were 200 buses that got put into a landfill at 1,000 miles away in Texas. And it's in the distribution system is totally ignored. Didn't even have to report it until like a year or two ago in the state of California, the deaths. And that's at $9 million per premature death. Also on the issue of housing and the issue of transportation, the big picture, transportation, jobs, housing, emissions, okay? This has to be looked at, it has to be coordinated. The home ownership program that the government's been hiding for 20 years has to be implemented and used to leverage these solar co-ops and owning the trucks and the solar systems and all this kind of stuff. And it has to be related to health, that's a real cost, it's a social cost, and to housing and the environment. It's not being done now, it has to be done, and right here in River City, start doing it, okay? For instance, the city that's been on the books since 2000 with the home ownership, so rent to own, and they only did 33 properties in LA. First, the crash came and stuff went down 10, 20, 30 cents on the dollar. Places could have been bought. They're hiding it. They did 33 units in LA. They were doing 100 grand now. With the 300 grand, they quit it. San Francisco did 6 units. It's outrageous.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Does that conclude the people who want to speak on public comment in CC8?
Do you want to speak, Todd?
Yes.
Todd Campbell would like to speak on public comment.
Okay.
Good morning, Dr. Burke. Good morning, members of the board and Mobile Source Committee. My name is Todd Campbell. I represent a company called Clean Energy, and for board members who don't know what Clean Energy does, we help deploy low NOx trucks and power them with renewable natural gas, not just throughout the basin, the state, but also the country. And Dr. Burke, I was laughing when you mentioned that when you see people come and speak to you that you haven't seen in a while. I believe I'm one of them. I think I missed my opportunity to talk on the warehouse rule, and I apologize. I was in another room chairing a committee meeting for the Natural Gas Vehicle Partnership. But what I wanted to say is the warehouse rule is an incredibly important rule. In fact, it's almost the only rule in town because the ports of LA and Long Beach have decided to move to a $10 rate for their truck rate. It essentially has gone from a plan that would transition the ports from going from diesel to near zero or zero to a plan that's going to be 2014 diesels until those fleets or trucks are turned over. And that is a really big problem, especially for people who live along the corridors, who live down at the ports in the diesel death zone. And this rule, in my view, is one of the beacons of hope for the basin. As we know, we need to reach attainment by 2023. And so I'm just going to say I'm very supportive of staff. I think Ian's done a great job and great leadership, and Clean Energy is here to help. The other thing I wanted to mention is not only does it need to be a strong rule and being implemented as soon as possible and correctly, it does need to be a little more flexible in terms of just near zero and zero. There are options where near zero is not being included, for example, yard hostlers. I think if electric or hydrogen ultimately is our end goal, but if it doesn't work for a warehouse, that warehouse needs the flexibility to do anything better than diesel. And that's the number one job here is we can't afford more diesels on the road. The final point I'm going to make is, what was the final point I was going to make? I'm getting old, Dr. Burke. I don't. So I appreciate your indulgence, but
I know that Andrew's going to call me.
Yes.
So you can ask him to include your final point.
I appreciate that. I know what my final point was. We need to put more points on the deployment of actual technologies that are reducing emissions. I know infrastructure is important, but I feel that the actual implementation of emission reduction mitigation measures is incredibly far more important, and we are running against time. If this administration that currently is in the federal government remains in place beyond the 2020 election, we are in deep trouble. And we need to do everything we can to reach attainment. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We have, I assume that concludes the testimony in CC8. Rita, do you have anything to say? No? Okay. We have, everybody left me here at the Lux, and there's nobody in Palm Desert, and there's nobody with Supervisor Bartlett. So I'm going to adjourn this meeting until February 21st, 2020 at 9 a.m. Thanks for coming.